Please be seated. Our Bible study, which is on Thursday mornings, 11 o'clock, so if you want to come and join us, that's great. 11 o'clock on Thursdays. Anyway, we have been going through the letter to the Hebrews, and we ran into a bit of a roadblock this Thursday. In the letter, the author of the letter, was talking about the Hebrews who were brought out of Egypt by Moses and were wandering around in the desert. And he said, these people, they had all these blessings, and all they did was complain, and they made God mad, and because of that, they were condemned, and they couldn't go to the Holy Land. And then the author basically says, watch it, or God's going to get you the same way. And in the middle of this, one of the members of the Bible study said, I have a real problem with this. You know, this is how cults work, where they threaten people with the wrath of God unless they obey. This is just controlling people. And that's true. This is exactly how cults work in a lot of ways. There's a lot of pressure to obey, to conform, because you'll get in trouble with God or the community in one way, shape, or form. Now, that is true. This is a little bit different, though, in a sense that the author of the Hebrews is telling or retelling an ancient story that has been told to them for centuries. Now, you probably remember that all of the Old Testament readings, at least certainly the first 5 books, they were written centuries after the events happened. And they are, in a sense, told to explain things that they didn't quite get, maybe. You know, for example, the rainbow in the sky. Why do we have a rainbow in the sky? Because of Noah. Why did they wander in the desert for 40 years? Because they made God mad. It couldn't possibly be that they hadn't figured out where they were going to go, or that they didn't know how to be a nation. It was because they made God mad. If you look at a lot of it, most everything that happens bad is because they made God mad. This is, by the way, not unique to the Israelites. Most cultures have these stories that explain things, first of all. They explain, you know, how the earth was made, how we had this river, how the stars got up in heaven. They explain all these stories, so this is nothing new. The use of it to sort of control people is also not really that new. So we have to accept that. But at least we know in the letter of the Hebrews, they're using the ancient stories. With Paul, it's a little bit different. And I'm not sure how much slack we can cut him on this one. Because in his letter today, these aren't the ancient stories he's telling. They're relatively new and relatively threatening. And you have to ask yourself, really? I mean, 23,000 destroyed for sexual immorality by God? I mean, let's face it, if people were destroyed for sexual immorality, we wouldn't have anybody here anymore. It would be a very, very small population. So what's going on with that? And that's just one example he gives, right? Those who were destroyed by this destroyer for complaining? That doesn't sound right. How do you read that anything other than manipulative and controlling? We're going to give Paul a little bit of slack for this one thing. Some biblical scholars believe that he was just having a bad time explaining himself, and that this was just a really badly written passage. He's trying to make a bridge between what he says before this and what he says after this. Before this, he says, he's talking about how Christians have this incredible freedom that they've never had before. For example, you can eat meat, any meat you want, and you can eat any meat, even if it was dedicated to an idol in an idolatrous shrine. Doesn't matter because the idol's nothing. And then he goes through this whole warning thing with the 23,000 and talking about how God will get them. And then he bridges that over to the nether passage where he says, what I'm trying to say is this: be careful with your freedom because it can hurt people. So I'm not sure how he made that bridge there, but I do know this. People understood the threats. They're used to this. This is not new. It was, in a sense, a model of the days. Something bad happens, blame God. Certainly it's a model of his time, but it's not a model of God. And Jesus addresses this pretty directly. Now, remember the gospel story, and if you forgot it, I'm happy to retell it to you. He's standing there, he's teaching, and some people there come to him and says, Jesus, what about those Galileans? Those Galileans had their blood mingled by Pilate with their sacrifices. Weren't they bad? You see, having your blood mingled with sacrifices is not just a horrible death. It's a scandal. It makes you essentially eternally impure. You might think, what's wrong with reporting this to Jesus? He might want to know this. This is kind of important stuff. But look at how he reacts to this. It's not, well, thanks for the information. He reacts with anger, which gives you a hint that what they're doing isn't just giving information. They're gloating. They are taking pleasure in what has happened to these Galileans. So Jesus says, wait a minute, what makes you think you're any better than them or in any better position than them just because this happened to them? Or what makes you think you're any better than those upon whom the Tower of Siloam fell in Jerusalem? And just for what it's worth, nobody really has any clue about the Tower of Siloam. There is no Tower of Siloam. The best guess, at least from some of the scholars, is that it was a tower that Pilate intended to build or was building, and of course was being built by Jerusalem laborers. And it collapsed, killing the laborers, and people took that to mean that God was not pleased with the tower and probably not pleased with the laborers because they are working on this foreign occupier's tower. That's the best we can come up with right now. Can't tell you if that's true or not, but it's a good guess. Either way, Jesus is making a point here. And the point is this: what you've come to do is to gloat. What you've come to do is to say how horrible they are. We do this too, by the way. You know this, the mingling of the blood with the sacrifices? We've seen a recent example of that in the news. Somebody was telling the story. It turns out to be an apocryphal story back in the pre-World War I days when General Pershing was in the Philippines. And I don't know if you heard this in the news, but it was told that in the Philippines, he had gathered up some Muslim rebels and had taken about 50 prisoners. And then he said to the soldiers, take your bullets and dip them in pig's blood. And then he had 49 of them executed with these bullets dipped in pig's blood as a warning, because of course the thinking was pig's blood is contamination to Muslims, they can't go to heaven then. And then he was to have sent one of them back to the village to say, look what these horrible Americans did, we can't fight them, they'll send us to hell. Turns out that never happened. And it wouldn't have mattered if it did anyway, because a Muslim cleric was responding to this story, and he said, you know, the pig's blood really wouldn't have bothered us that much. Now, the bullets, they would have bothered us. But we tell these stories because we want to believe that they are so much worse, and we want to make them suffer somehow. And Jesus says, you know, It's not these things like sexual immorality that are really what's going to get God so mad. That's not going to separate you from the love of God, which means, if you're used to going to confession, to private confession and saying, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, I had impure thoughts, don't bother with that. That's not the sort of thing that separates us from God. Rather, what separates us from God, who is love, is the willful lack of love, the desire to condemn, the lack of caring for the other. How we relate with God and how we relate with each other, that's what God cares about. God, as Jesus says, has little interest in punishment. Look through the Gospels. What is one of the best stories of Jesus that Jesus tells? The prodigal son. A kid who never, by the way, said he was sorry, but it didn't matter. Because the father loved him, and he said, okay, all right. It's not those little actions. It's the love. So in this Lenten season, where we are called upon to look at our own lives, to look at how we treat other people, how we interact with God, let me suggest to you not to say, did I have some chocolate when I gave it up for Lent? Did I go a little too fast on the highway? You want to drive safely because you want to be a safe driver. But those aren't the real things to look at. Ask yourself, am I loving my neighbor? Are the actions I take, are the words I say, are they loving? Not just to my family, not just to my friends. We're thinking of people here in church, because we're all very loving people, right? But to the one who I am convinced has no redeeming qualities. Am I speaking words of love? Am I performing acts of love? That's the only question we really need to ask ourselves. When Jesus says the thing that separates us from God is the willful lack of love, it's not punishment. It's just simply that love and not love can't exist together. Now, I do not know if there is eternal punishment for those who never love. I don't know. I don't know how God will treat those who simply choose to condemn, who choose to look at with contempt at everyone else. I do not know. But there's one thing I know from these lessons, and that is, that's none of my business. I only have one job. And that is to see Christ in every person I encounter, to act in love around whomever I may meet, and those I will never meet, and to share that love today and every day. And frankly, for me at least, that's more than enough for a lifetime. Amen.